Okay, so let me go back to the theme rainfall of modeling. I said that now we try to take a more theoretical approach with respect to the empirical one that we adopted so far. And in the empirical example that I just finished to treat, I underlined that the physical justification for the empirical relationship that we adopted was conservation of water, conservation of mass of water. And in fact, if we want to write a mathematical model to describe the rainfall runoff relationship, as I anticipated, we have to build a box which contains some mathematical equations to transform the input to the output. And how many equations? In the example that I just dealt with, it was just one equation, expressing, as I said, in some way, the water balance. In general, a mathematical model is constituted by a system of equations, so more than one. And the minimum number of equations is dictated by the number of variables, the number of unknowns. And therefore, we have for sure one unknown, which is the hydrograph, one unknown variable, which is the flow, the river flow, the runoff. At least one, as I said, but we may have more unknowns because, for instance, there could be more than one output variable, like, for instance, you may want to know also the groundwater level. Not just the river flow, but you may want to know the groundwater level. So this is one more variable. It means that, of course, the number of equations increases. And also, you may have the presence of state variables. So variables that are different from the output because it's not the kind of variable you are directly interested in, but it's a state variable, meaning a variable that describes the state of the system. And you may have the necessity to know the state of the system if the knowledge of the state becomes necessary to compute the output. So this course is a bit complicated, but let me make a very simple example. Let's assume that you want to know the water storage of the catchment, because the storage is needed by a given model, for instance, to compute the runoff, the river runoff. In the case of the model of the time area method, storage was not needed because we didn't account for any change in storage. We just moved the water from upstream to downstream, no storage. But in many cases, storage is important because there are basins that can store a lot of water. And therefore, to describe the river flow, you need also to describe the storage. And the storage is a typical state variable. It describes the state of the system, the storage of the system at a given time. Therefore, the thing that you have to do is, once that you selected the modeling scheme and you have a given application, to count the number of output variables that you need to model and the number of state variables, depending on the scheme that you may want to adopt. And, of course, to find an appropriate number of equations to model these variables, depending on rainfall. And what are the equations, the principles that you may apply to do that? And we have already had an example, which is conservation of mass of water, water balance. This is the continuity equation for water is the first basic principle that you have to take into account. Conservation of the mass of water, which is also called continuity equation for water. In fact, keep in mind that conservation of mass and conservation of energy are always satisfied in fluid mechanics. We are talking about movement of fluid, therefore it's obvious to refer to fluid mechanics, which is the science that studies the movement of fluids. We need some adaptation of classical fluid mechanics, but still, it's fluid mechanics what we are studying here. And in fluid mechanics, keep in mind, conservation of mass and conservation of energy, including conservation of momentum, are always satisfied. So far we applied just conservation of mass, but we have also at disposal conservation of energy, conservation of momentum. And also Newton's laws are always satisfied. Did I introduce already Newton's laws last lecture? No. But it's very simple. Newton's laws are 3 laws, and the first law says that, let me try to translate, it says that every object in a state of uniform motion tends to remain in that state unless an external force is applied to it. So an object that is in a state of uniform motion includes the object not moving, remains in that state of uniform motion unless an external force is applied to it. This is the first law, first Newton. So, conservation of state. The second Newton law is the classical F equal m times a, means that a force applied to an object induces an acceleration of the object that is proportional to its mass. And third, to any action corresponds an action which is equal intensive and opposite. I'm not sure my translation in English is fine. Again, to any action applied to an object corresponds an equal action but opposite. Forza uguale contraria. Okay? And it's called in English a principle of action and reaction. I'm not very good in translating these laws because actually in hydrology they are not explicitly used in this form. So I'm not familiar with the terminology. While I'm more familiar with the conservation of mass and energy, which are instead basic principles for hydrology. But I think from a cultural point of view it's important to say that in fluid mechanics Newton's laws are satisfied. And I think you understood what I meant, even if my translation was not perfect. And now there is an additional reasoning that we have to make. If we want to apply a conservation law, we have to define the control volume. The control volume means the volume of space to which the conservation principle is applied. And it's a volume, typically, that contains fluid, contains water. Not all the volume is necessarily occupied by water. We may refer, for instance, to a underground control volume, which is occupied partially by water, possibly, and partially by soil. But we have to define, if we want to apply a conservation law, which is basically expressed in integral or differential form, can be expressed in both forms, differential form or integral form, but in order to apply the principle, we have to specify the control volume. This control volume, typically for us in hydrology, is fixed in space. It's not a moving control volume. It's typically fixed. And typically, the control volume from which we start is the watershed, the catchment, as we did for the time area method. So basically, if we want to refer to the catchment and assume, use the catchment to define the control volume, it means that we want to apply our conservation law at the catchment scale. Okay? And this is usually the starting point. People in the past started from the catchment. Why they started from the catchment? First of all, because they didn't have the means to refer to smaller control volumes. It's because they didn't have the capability to refer to smaller control volumes, because if you decrease the scale of representation, you need more intensive computational means. Because basically, at the end, your scale of reference is the catchment, because, of course, you want to model the flow in a cross-section of a river, and therefore you have to refer to the catchment. And then you have a choice whether or not to consider the catchment as just one control volume, a unique control volume, or subdivide the catchment in smaller control volumes. At the end, you have always to refer to the catchment, because if you want to model the flow in a cross-river section, you have to consider what happens in the catchment. You have to take into account that. And therefore, at the end, you have to refer to that scale. And the model can be applied on the catchment as a rule, or you can subdivide in sub-catchments. I think I have shown to you the picture where I noticed how the catchment can be divided in subgrids. This is a discretization. It means that you apply your principle not at the catchment scale, but at a smaller scale. But of course, it is intuitive that you need more computational means if you decide to refer to smaller scales. If you define the control volume by making reference to the catchment is a surface, is defined as a surface. So you have to, if you want to define a volume that is based on the catchment, of course you need to say something more. If you work at the catchment scale, your control volume is given by the catchment surface plus the groundwater, so the portion of underground which is deemed relevant. So you refer to the catchment surface and include a portion of underground so obtaining a volume. And you have to include the relevant underground, meaning the portion of underground where you have water fluxes. So you have a volume that is delimited by the catchment surface, and underground is delimited by a surface that you fix by including all the relevant underground. on this volume that you have defined, you have to apply your conservation laws. But again, I want to stress that you can also decide to subdivide this catchment control volume, this control volume that makes reference to the whole catchment. You can subdivide it in smaller volumes. And typically, this is done by subdividing the catchment surface in sub-portions and including the soil, the relevant soil that is beneath each portion of catchment. And there are basically two ways for subdividing a catchment in smaller portions. You can decide, this is the catchment, and if you think to the underground, the relevant underground, you get a volume, okay? And you can subdivide the catchment either by taking sub-basins. I think I already mentioned to you this opportunity. And therefore, you have a sub-catchment that is given by this sub-basin here, and another one that is here. And then you have what is called interbasin here. So you see that if you identify sub-catchments, you divide the catchment in many parts, and you use, in this case, the technique of identifying always watersheds, sub-watersheds, sub-catchments. But you may also decide to use just a regular discretization, just to draw a grid. And I mentioned to you that if you want to use a small scale, you end up with many and many sub-portions of catchment. Then on each of these control volume, you have to apply your basic principles, your conservation laws. Okay, now, how to apply a conservation law? Of course, there are many forms of conservation laws. It depends on the quantity that you conserve and also on the property that you conserve. And also it depends on the way you write them down. And, but there is a general form for conservation laws for fluids. And I think it's important from a theoretical point of view to refer to this general theorem, conservation theorem, that is valid for any extensive property of the fluid, of water. And this is the Reynolds transport theorem. Now, I'm trying to write it in the same way as it is written on my supporting documents. And so let me write it in this way. What is Reynolds transport theorem? Is a conservation law for any extensive property of the fluid. And let me call, now I will define also what is an extensive property. And let me write it in this way. The variation in time of the total amount of an extensive property, N, is written in the way that I will show you. The extensive property is a property of the fluid which depends on the volume of fluid. Like mass. Mass of fluid is an extensive property. It is proportional to the volume. Energy is another extensive property. It's proportional to the volume. Momentum, again, is an extensive property. So we can use this formulation, the Reynolds transport theorem, to describe conservation of mass, energy, and momentum, and many others. Like also, if I wanted to write the conservation law for a pollutant, the pollutant is proportional to the volume of fluid, generally if it is well mixed, we can use it. We are interested in the conservation of mass, energy, and momentum, but this is a general conservation law for any property that is proportional, again, to the volume of fluid. And you see, I'm writing here the variation in time of the total amount. This is a way of writing a conservation law, of course, because writing the change in time means also it's a way to write the conservation law, to write the balance along time of this extensive property. And this can be written as the sum of two terms. The first is a volume integral, which is the integral of the partial derivative along time of the product of two quantities. Let's indicate them as rho and eta. What are these two quantities? Rho is the mass balance of the fluid, the mass density of the fluid. And eta is the rate of the extensive property n per unit mass. This means that, let's think at eta as n per unit mass. So, n per unit mass multiplied by mass per unit volume means the quantity n per unit volume. Therefore, if you multiply the quantity of n per unit volume times the volume, you get again the variation in time of n. So the structure is quite intuitive. This is the partial derivative in time of the quantity of n per unit volume inside the control volume. What is this, basically? Is a source term. Let's think about your volume, control volume. How can your property, energy, mass, momentum, change within this control volume? There are two processes that can change in fluid mechanics the amount of this property within the control volume. Either transport processes, like through the control surface of the control volume, you have an entrance of energy, momentum, or mass. Like, I refer to the catchment, I have an input of water, rainfall, or water that is exiting through the river. This is a flow, transport process, okay, which is not this one. Or you can have a source term. So within the control volume, you can have some amount of the quantity that you want to conserve that is created. Like, imagine, for instance, to a source term, like a source of water, which is not related to rainfall. Let's imagine that you have in your catchment some water that is coming from underground. This could be considered also a flow due to transport process, but you can also consider it as a source of water within the catchment. So this is a source term. This means that if you have a change of either the mass density of water. Let's imagine that in the control volume you have a change in pressure and you have a change of the mass density of water. Then this is a source term. So if you have a change of the mass density of water or a change of the property per unit mass within the volume, it is included here in the source term. This source term can change your amount of the quantity even if you don't have transport processes. Let's imagine that, for instance, you have a volume and the mass of water that inside this volume changes even if you don't have any entrance or any water exiting. This is possible if you generate water inside the volume. And you need to take this into account because you may have in your catchment sources of energy, sources of momentum that are not considered as transport processes. Okay, and then there is a second term. Let's now consider that the control volume is fixed. In the slides there are three terms because there is a general formulation of the Reynolds transport theorem that also takes into account that the control volume can shift. And therefore, if it shifts, of course, you have a transport process. You have possibly some fluid, even if the fluid is not moving, is stable, is static, but you change the position of the control volume. Of course, you have transport processes through the surface of the control volume. We ignore this, but in the slides you will find three terms. We ignore this third term in order to make things simpler, and then but we may have transport processes that come from the fact that the fluid is moving. And this is, of course, what we have. Because we have water flowing out of the watershed through the river, so we have transport processes. So we have an integral that is extended over the control surface. And in this case, we have another term which is again this quantity rho eta that multiplies the vector of the velocity of the fluid, which is a local vector, and this is multiplied with the scalar product by the normal versor to ds. Normal versor, which is this is a plus, so it's entering is the direction is inside the control volume. This normal versor is directed inside the control volume. Let me see if I was correct. Yes. This describes the transport processes. You will never see such a complicated writing in hydrological models because actually we use this conservation principle in a more specific form which refers to mass, energy, momentum, but usually these more specific forms are more simple. Like, I'm not sure you remember the Torricelli equation for computing. This is a relevant example, so let me make it. Let's suppose that you have a tank which contains water which is not moving. Is water hydrostatic condition, and so in hydrostatic condition this water surface is horizontal. Let's indicate with h the height of the water inside the tank, and let's suppose that you open an hole in the bottom of the tank. You can compute the velocity with which water comes out from the bottom of the tank through Torricelli equation, and this is an equation that you studied in hydraulics, and it's written in this way: velocity v is given by the square root of 2 times acceleration of gravity g times h, which is multiplied by a coefficient that takes into account that you have some losses of energy and a contraction of the flow here. And let me think about, but sorry, this is just for flow. You can avoid, there is no CD. CD is for the computation of flow. The velocity is just given by this relationship here. This is Torricelli equation. I want to, please take a note because it's important in hydrology. This is an expression of conservation of energy. If you go back to your background and you remember how you computed this equation, it's an energy balance equation. You take potential energy here on the water surface, and you equate the potential energy over the water surface to the kinetic energy of the water flowing out from the bottom. This is a conservation law, energy law, and you see it's much more simple than Reynolds theorem. Okay? But I think it is important to take into account that conservation law, in our example, is given by these two components, a source term and a transport term. Okay? This is also called a convective term because it is due to transport. And again, we assume that in our case the control volume is fixed, and therefore the transport term exists if water is moving. And please take into account that sometimes to distinguish between source terms and convective terms is just a matter of convention. Like rainfall. Of course, it's more logic, it's more justified in my view to define rainfall as a contribution due to a transport term because it's a movement of fluid that enters into the control volume. But you consider it also as you can consider it also as a source term if you wish. It's not really, but in some cases the difference is more objective. Like if you consider a river stream, of course you have water entering upstream and water exiting downstream. In this case, it's clearly a transport, a convective contribution to the water balance. And I conclude by saying that if this is called extensive property, which depends on the volume of fluid, is proportional on the volume of fluid, the product of rho times eta is called intensive property. It's the property, extensive property per unit volume. It does not depend anymore on the volume. Okay? Okay, I think I can stop here. We put the basis for writing conservation laws, and we will see next lecture how this conservation law helps us to set up the equation that we need to compute the rate for Runoff transformation. I'm sorry because the lack of the PC brought me to teach, we say by heart in Abraccio, and I hope the logical sequence of the lecture was anyway clear. But of course, when you don't see the slides, maybe that it becomes more spontaneous, but maybe also it becomes more messy. So if you have any question next time, please don't hesitate to ask me.